introduce the theme for the coming year, and we also introduce the Bible verse that will guide us. So for instance, last year we were coming out of the pandemic and kind of trying to figure things out, what it means to be church and what we need to be focused on. And our theme for last year, beginning at the end of August through the school year, was re-church. We need to figure out how we're going to do that again. And our theme verse was Acts 2:42, which reminded us how the first apostles built the church on the apostles' teaching, the stories about Jesus, and focus on his life and ministry and the things that he taught, fellowship, spending time together as God's people, the breaking of bread, which is communion, and corporate worship, and prayers, praying with and for each other. And a year later, those four things continue to be the foundation, really, of everything that we do as a church. So it's important that we not only remember, but practice what's been handed down to us, our tradition. But life goes on. The grass still needs to be mowed, the bills still need to be paid, the kids still need to be sent off to school. At church, we still need to find volunteers to work in FCC Cafe and the nursery, and we need to do this and we need to do that. And so we don't live on a mountaintop. We're not always experiencing spiritual highs. A lot of the time, we feel lucky to be just getting by, kind of like that balloon that was half inflated, or maybe even not that. We just feel lucky to be getting by. When our staff met months ago now to begin plans for this year, that's a little bit how we were feeling. It was like, here we go again. It's another year. It's another celebration Sunday. So what do we do? Where do we go next? Because life goes on. The church goes on. Many pastors and church leaders, if they're being honest, would probably put one word, at least this word, on their to-do list for the future, and that word is survival. Now, we want to see the church and its ministries continue, but there are a lot of forces at work in the world against that. And for those of us who love the church, that can be kind of scary. It can be easy to kind of get into a survival mindset. And unfortunately, that's not the kind of mindset that leads to healthy mission and ministry. It really isn't. Once a church gets into survival mode, where it's more concerned about itself and its survival than it is about fulfilling the mission and ministry that Jesus gave to it, to share the gospel with the whole world, then it's no longer the life-giving vessel that God needs it to be. It's something else, but it's not that. In the course of our staff brainstorming, we wrote down the word surviving. And then we literally crossed it out and wrote thriving instead. And I noticed in our boardroom there's a whiteboard, and that's still there from that day. We actually did that, wrote that up there, and it's still there. And the reason we say that is because a church that's functioning as God intends it to function doesn't just survive. It thrives, even in the midst of inevitable challenges. And there will always be challenges. There will always be forces arrayed against it, against us, against the gospel. And the same is true for us as individuals too. We don't just exist. We don't just survive from day to day until our time finally runs out. In Jesus, we are meant to have abundant life. We are meant to thrive. And as we'll see, that's a life that never ends. Now, before I say anything else about that, I don't want to give anybody the impression that this year is going to be just about the power of positive thinking. Because sometimes we're going to face the fact that sometimes life can be hard. We can't always be sunny and smiling. It doesn't work like that. But we can find peace in our faith. We can remain connected to the true source of life and love through everything. In fact, it is as close to us as the air we breathe, as our very next breath. This year at Advanced Conference, which is this young adult conference I've been going to and been a keynote speaker at for 20-some years now, an old friend of mine led our Bible study every morning. So after breakfast, we would gather in the gymnasium, we'd sit on these benches, and some of the more extroverted among us, like myself, would be chattering and talking, laughing. Others, still a little bleary-eyed with sleep, would be drinking their coffee kind of quietly. And in the middle of all that noise and confusion, my friend Seth would start out and he would say quietly, "Everybody breathe in. Everybody breathe out. Everybody breathe in. Everybody breathe out." And then people would begin to hear him, and then we would join him. And by the time he was done doing that for a minute or two, we were all focused and centered. It was really kind of a neat exercise. It got us right where we needed to be for that time of Bible study and prayer. Now, I read something interesting this week that actually reminded me of that, about the connection of breathing and prayer. The author makes the case that the simple act of breathing in and breathing out reminds us of our connection to the Creator, our connection to God. He writes about how when Moses asks God for God's name at the burning bush, the name that God gives Moses in the original Hebrew looks like this, YHWH. Okay, because in ancient Hebrew there were no vowels. Now we've added vowels in the English to make the name Yahweh. But scholars and rabbis noticed a long time ago that the letters YHWH represent breathing sounds. Think about that. In other words, when we pronounce the name of God, either with or without the vowels, it actually sounds like breathing. Yahweh, Yahweh. The author then writes, so a baby's first cry, his first breath speaks the name of God. How perfect is that? A deep sigh calls his name. Even an atheist would speak his name unaware that their very breath is giving constant acknowledgement to God. Being alive means I speak his name constantly. And then the author finishes by saying, this fills me with emotion every time I grasp the thought. God chose to give himself a name that we can't help but speak every moment we're alive. All of us, always, everywhere, waking, sleeping, breathing with the name of God on our lips. As we begin a year focused on thriving and on abundant life, I don't want us to ever forget that God is always as close to us as our next breath. God is with us. That's the promise of Jesus. Emmanuel, God is with us. But here's the thing. God calls us to more than just survival, to more than just breathing in and breathing out. We have been created to grow and to thrive and to share the good news of God's love with others. Jesus said, seek and you shall find. In other words, if you seek abundant life, you'll find it. It's not hidden. It's available to anyone who wants it. But unfortunately, we often seek life in places it doesn't exist. We think it exists there, but it doesn't. In the year 1980, which seems like yesterday to me, but it was not anymore. It's the year I graduated from high school. There was a song that came out on the radio. It was a country song, but it made its way onto the pop charts, and it was called Looking for Love in All the Wrong Places. Remember that? Anybody? Am I the only? Some of you remember that? Looking for love in all the wrong places. That's what we do. We look for love. We look for abundant life in places where it doesn't exist. Maybe you're familiar with the term self-medication. It's something that a lot of us do. Maybe all of us do at some point or another. Most of the time we think of self-medication as what happens when people turn to drugs or alcohol. I saw an Onion article this week that said marijuana still ranks among the best treatments for persistent existence. And that's supposed to be funny, but it's funny because it's absolutely true. It's why people do turn to drugs of all kinds, because it somehow numbs that persistent existence. It helps us escape it for a moment or two. It seems like it's giving life even when it doesn't. Thomas Aquinas, the great 13th century saint and theologian, once said, "There's a God-shaped vacuum in every one of us that only Christ can fill." In the absence of God, we try to fill that void, that vacuum, that hole with other things, which is why we self-medicate with things like drugs and alcohol. And sometimes those substances do offer a kind of peace, I guess, and joy. It's why they're so popular. They don't give life, and they don't fill the void. Now, of course, there are lots of other ways people self-medicate too, and so I don't want us to pass that over. Maybe for you it's shopping. Maybe for you it's food, which are certainly, those are things that are a lot more socially acceptable in church circles. But again, if that's where you seek abundant life, you're always going to come up empty. You're always going to need more of whatever it is that you think is giving you that life and that peace. And it's never going to be enough. More fame, more money, more romance, more free time, more snacks, more whatever. It's said that when Alexander the Great finished conquering the known world, he wept, saying, "There are no more worlds to conquer." He achieved the pinnacle of power and success in his lifetime, probably more so than any other human that's ever lived, and he still wasn't happy. Years ago, there was a family in our church that owned a bunch of nursing homes. This was a really wealthy family, and they took me and my kids on their yacht to an amusement park called Cedar Point in Ohio, which, by the way, is the greatest amusement park that's ever existed. If you ever get a chance to go there, you should. So we slept in the boat in the marina there at Cedar Point, and this boat, it slept probably something like 10 people, 12 people. Probably cost more than any home I've ever owned, and yet on that first night in the Cedar Point marina, we sat on the deck of that boat, and we looked and admired and maybe even envied a boat that was sitting at the end of the dock, a much bigger boat. This boat had a full crew. It had a helicopter and a helicopter pad. It had a little crane with a Jeep that could come down, and I mean, it was cool. And I'm sure there was probably a little boat sitting next to us with people on it looking at the boat we were on, right? The point is, somebody is always going to have a bigger boat, a bigger house, a more successful life. But as nice as those things can be, none of them offer abundant life. None of them are going to fill that void, that God-shaped void in you. In fact, sometimes those things that we think are going to bring us happiness and contentment actually wind up being the things that take them away, that steal from us. Our theme verse for this year is John 10:10b, which means it's the second half of the 10th verse of the 10th chapter of John, in which Jesus says, "I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." But on this first week, I want to locate that verse in its original context, okay? Because just before Jesus promises us abundant life, he also warns us about all the counterfeits out there, about the things that can steal life from us. So we read in John 10, verses 7 through 10. "So again Jesus said to them, 'Very truly, I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and bandits, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters by me will be saved and will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. Jesus came that we might have abundant life, and that's the promise we're going to be exploring this year. But there's obviously a warning in there too. That's why Jesus told us we had to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves, because there are lots of counterfeits, lots of things that are trying to steal that peace and that life from you. The other night, I saw a Liberty Mutual insurance commercial on TV. Maybe you've seen it too. I think it says the quiet part out loud about our human nature. The spokesperson begins the commercial by saying, "We've been told by advertising experts, by our consultants, that people tend to remember commercials that include young people having a good time," right? So here's a group of young people having a good time with insurance. And then it shows a pool party. Shows a pool party with young people having a good time with insurance. It's kind of stupid, isn't it? I mean, it is. And yet, those advertising consultants are probably right. The world tells us that youth and beauty are the end-all and the be-all of happiness. What company wouldn't want to be associated with that, right? So it'll probably sell insurance, otherwise they wouldn't be doing it. Why else would they do that? They even tell us they're doing it, and it still works. Again, the very things we think will help us thrive, like youth, wealth, beauty, and fame, they never live up to their hype. If they did, why are so many young, beautiful, rich, and famous people so desperately unhappy? And why do so many self-medicate? I still think about Michael Jackson and the tragedy of his life, especially at the end. He had just about everything a celebrity could hope for in terms of achievement, in terms of fame, and the quality of the art that he created. As you might remember, he didn't just want to get high to medicate his persistent existence and numb himself. He wanted to check out completely every now and then. I don't know if you remember this, but he actually had a doctor on call that would come to his house and anesthetize him. Sadly, that doctor eventually gave him too much anesthesia. And that was it. He was done. The thing that he thought was giving him a little bit of peace wound up being the thing that stole his life from him. And there have been plenty of others that have fallen into that same trap. Jesus said, "I am the gate for the sheep." In other words, Jesus is the door to life. And we're not talking about the empty counterfeit stuff the world offers us, but real life, abundant life. Through Jesus, we can come alive to God. And the good news is that that's a life that never ends. Not even death can stop it. Sometimes pastors and churches act as if believing in Jesus is something that affects what happens to us after we die. I've heard this even described as fire insurance. Think about it. In other words, we make our confession of faith so we don't go to hell. But it's so much more than that. Jesus invites us to come alive to God. Not the moment we stop breathing God's name in this world, but right now, when we can still be a part of what God is doing in the world. Right now. Years ago, I had a retired school principal that was a member of the church I served. And he had this kind of life. It just bubbled over in him. And so when I'd see him at church on a Sunday morning, I'd say, "Hey, Jack, how you doing?" And his answer was always the same. He'd say, "Super great, but I'll get better." Every single time. Never failed. Even after he was diagnosed with leukemia, his answer never changed. The memorial service we held for him at the church was probably the biggest one I've ever done. It was a giant building, and we probably had 400 or 500 people there, overflow kind of service. And at that service, I told the story of how the day before Jack died, the nurse came in to give him his medicine. She asked him how he was doing. You might imagine he said, super great, but I'll get better. And at the end of the memorial service, I said, and a day later, that's exactly what happened. Jack knew Jesus. He went in through that gate. He lived in that abundant life right up until the very end. And when he stopped breathing God's name in this world, his abundant life continued in the next. That's the promise we have. That's the invitation that's been extended to us. The question you need to ask yourself today is this: are you thriving? Really thriving? Or are you merely surviving? Are you trying to fill that God-shaped vacuum in your life with things that aren't working, that may even be stealing from you? If you suspect that you are, and by the way, this is a very common part of human existence, so there's a good chance you are, and I don't want to say it's okay because it's not. God wants more than that from you, but if you suspect that you are, it is okay because that's the first step. Just knowing that is the first step, and the good news is that you are right where you need to be. Jesus said, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. He wasn't kidding. And that's the promise that we can count on, both in this life and the next. Amen.